Given adequate evidence for this conclusion, the book of Daniel in chronological order, chapter by chapter, would be this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 11, 10, 12, 9. Now, you just thought you knew how to count when you got out of kindergarten. I thought I knew how to count until I studied the book of Daniel. But most, if not all, the so-called major prophets are not written in precise chronological order. And if you read Isaiah, Jeremiah, perhaps not Lamentations, but Ezekiel and definitely Daniel, you can kind of tell that the books are not laid out in chronological order, and that's okay. Why is that? I don't know. I really don't. Perhaps some of it is grouped topically, but here's what I would suggest. Do your best and study it. And when this old body gives up, you meet Jesus, ask him. Because he can tell you for sure why it's written that way. I could only just shoot in the dark and guess, so he knows. So my advice to you is live and die as a faithful Christian, then ask Jesus. And whatever he tells you, there's the reason. Now, we've been studying the book of Daniel, and we've learned a tremendous amount about Jehovah God. In chapter 1, Jehovah is the God who cares about his faithful children. In chapter 2, he is the God who reveals secrets. In chapter 3, he's the God who delivers the faithful. In chapter 4, he is the God who rules all. In chapter 7, his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. In chapter 8, he is the God who punishes those who punish his people. And in chapter 5 tonight, we will see clearly that God is not mocked. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. We will see that from Daniel chapter 5 tonight. And tonight's sermon is entitled MENE MENE TEKEL UPHARSIN. Say, that man's up there talking in tongues. No, man. That's in the text of Daniel chapter 5. And perhaps as we go through it, you'll see why. So let's open our Bibles up to Daniel chapter 5. 3 things we're going to do tonight. 2 come from the text, and then we'll give some application. In the first place, in Daniel 5, verses 1 through 16, let's see the miracle. And then let's take those 16 verses, and then we'll section them up too. So in Daniel 5, verses 1 through 4, let's see the defilement. See what Daniel 5 and verse 1 says. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar was co-regent with his father Nabonidus, and Nabonidus was apparently married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and thus Belshazzar the king was actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Now, one thing to keep in mind about Belshazzar is that he was co-regent. That is, his daddy, Nabonidus, was number 1. So Belshazzar was a technical number 2, and that kind of comes into play through the rest of this chapter. Wine, in this context, undoubtedly refers to the intoxicating and sinful kind. If you can't remember anything else about wine, try to burn in your mind Proverbs 20 and verse 1. If you don't know what that says, good. Maybe you'll turn there and read it, and you'll see what intoxicating wine does to people. Verse number 2. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, obviously fermented and alcoholic, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, a point of concern here, Daniel did not make an historical error. Father in this context means descendant or ancestor. Technically speaking, Nebuchadnezzar was not his father, like my father is like I am Logan's father. Father in this context means ancestor, and it was technically his grandfather, but that's okay. Which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then, verse 3, they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. Now, these are thoughtless and arrogant actions for those who generally choose to imbibe alcohol. Nebuchadnezzar had basically taken these vessels and left them in captivity. You understand? He took them, but he didn't abuse them in the way that Belshazzar and his people have here. Now, verse number 4. They drank wine and praised. Who did they praise? Praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. One thing that you kind of don't see, unless you've read ahead at this point in the text, is that as we move forward, there is really no doubt that the Medes and the Persians are all over Babylon, because we're going to see what happens to Belshazzar toward the end. Now, one question that's always been in my mind that I reckon Jesus will have to answer when I die would be, did he know for a fact that the Medes and the Persians were all about him? And really, when you begin to understand Belshazzar's character, did he even care? Did he even care that his enemy was all basically knocking at his door? And then here he may know that and think, what? Hey, I got an idea. Let's have a drinking party. Let's have a drinking party and let's praise the God, all these false gods. Let's just have us a grand old time with the Medes and the Persians all over us. What kind of king is that, I wonder? Well, in Daniel 5, verses 5 through 9, let's see the disturbance. Something's going to happen. Verse number 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick, this is King James language, upon the plaster, that is the plaster, of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now, how do you explain that? I suppose maybe drunk people may get drunk enough off wine and see all kinds of stuff. That could be, but what this is not natural. This is supernatural. Me and this wall back here spend a lot of time together. And I look back at that wall and I imagine in a king's palace you would have a wall that would probably put that one to shame as far as just sheer size-wise. Could you imagine seeing a hand, if you look back there at that wall? I can see it in my mind, maybe you can too, just a hand appearing out of nowhere and start writing on that great big huge wall back there. Now how would you explain that? Friend, there's no natural explanation for that. That is definitely supernatural. That is, it is above the natural order of things. Hands just don't appear out of the air and start writing on walls, do they? No. Now, keep this in mind. Let's see what happens when people actually see something supernatural. Verse number 6. Then the king, that's Belshazzar's countenance. Countenance has to do with your face. The king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him. Reckon he's feeling guilty about drinking wine, and drinking wine out of the golden vessels out of the Lord's house. Wouldn't you get a little nervous? Yeah, I believe I would too. And his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote. My Bible has a translation mark that says not. His knees smote one against another. Now, I've been scared a few times in my life. If you were to ask me, Brock, tell me about the time you were the most scared in your life, I'd tell you. And it would surprise you when it was. But the most scared I ever was in my life, I was literally paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move, I couldn't think. I thought I was going to die. And when you hear the context of the way it happened, it's actually pretty funny. But the difference between that and this is, this man was scared to death. He has seen, and not just him, but those with him have seen something supernatural that they cannot wrap their minds around while they were in the middle of acting awful. No doubt about that at all. So, genuine miracles had a profound effect upon people, and this is no different. What would you think? Sober, drunk, whatever you were, if a hand appeared right in the middle of the air and started writing on that wall, what would you think? Yeah, you don't know for sure. Well, let's see what happens. Verse number 7. The king cried aloud to bring in, now look who he wants around him, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing. Now understand that. There was writing on the wall, but they couldn't read it. Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, number 1. And number 2, have a chain of gold about his neck. And number 3, shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now maybe that sticks out in your mind. Why would Belshazzar say the third ruler? Well, I can answer that. That's as high as he could give. Because Nabonidus, his father, was technically number 1. Technically, Belshazzar, as being co-regent with his father, was number 2. So he's offering the highest level of authority that he could give. And that is the third ruler in the kingdom of Babylon. Now look at verse number 8. Then came in all the king's wise men. Well, where's Daniel? Do you not recall from Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had basically made Daniel a wise man? Well, Daniel wasn't called in initially in Daniel chapter 2. Why was that? Perhaps in Daniel chapter 2 he was too young and too inexperienced. But now by the time we've hit chapter 5, perhaps Daniel's a little old. And perhaps they feel like he's maxed himself out from his prime, at least some of them have. Then came in all the king's wise men, but what could they do? They could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. What do you call these people in our vernacular? They are false teachers. They are false prophets. And God never worked through a false prophet to determine or to decipher a real and genuine miracle. These men could have sat there and studied the writing on that wall for the rest of their lives. And they would have never figured it out because they were fakes and they were phonies. Verse 9. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled. Now he's brought in his wise men, and how wise are they? They don't know anymore what that writing on the wall means and what he knew. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance, his face was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now remember how all this started? How did all this start? Hey, let's go get the vessels from the house of the Lord that my granddaddy Nebuchadnezzar took, and let's drink fermented alcoholic wine and praise all these false gods. Boy, they were having a good time, weren't they? Now all of a sudden, look what's happened in the course of 9 verses. He's scared to death. He can't figure out what's going on. Now in Daniel 5, verses 10 through 16, let's see the desire. Look at verses 10 through 12. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. Queen here perhaps has reference to his mother, who would be Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. Now it could be that this is one of his wives, but from the overall context and how people really seem to respect her, and she does seem to have somewhat of a lick of sense, it probably was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, for what it's worth. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. That's basically a term of respect. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Verse 11. There is, now watch this, if not, you'll miss it. Some may say Brock's crazy when he says this isn't written in chronological order. Go back and read chapter 1. Daniel was one of the children of Judah. Now look at how the queen of Babylon, probably Belshazzar's mother, refers to him. There is a man, I'm telling you, a tremendous amount of time has occurred between chapter 1 and chapter 5. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Remember, this is coming from a heathen. And in the days of thy father, that would be grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, that is grandfather, the king, I say, thy father, descendant, ancestor, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Verse 12. Now watch this. Recall who's speaking. This is the queen of Babylon, perhaps Belshazzar's mother. Watch how she talks about Daniel. Just watch. And look at what she's already said, but look at verse 12. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Don't miss that T-E there. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. There are some still in Babylon at this time who could recall the great things that from their perspective Daniel had done, But Daniel would even say, look, I didn't do this on my own. God revealed these things to me. So Daniel was definitely a legitimate prophet of God. Even the heathen respected him. Look how they talked about Daniel. You see a lesson there? Wonder how your friends and co-workers and those who know you would talk about you when you weren't in the room. Daniel was nowhere to be found as far as in the king's banquet hall at the time. And look how they talked about him. Wonder how they talk about you when you leave. Anyway, verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. Let's get a brief review. Daniel chapter 1 is set in 606 BC. Virtually no one really disputes that. Daniel would have been, in Daniel chapter 1, perhaps between 12 and 18 years old. Now keep that in your mind. Virtually everyone concedes that by the time we hit Daniel chapter 5, it is 539 BC. Now let that sink in for just a second. 606 in Daniel chapter 1, 539 BC in Daniel chapter 5. Even if Daniel were 12 years old, he's at least 79 years old in this chapter. Do you see why perhaps they didn't call Daniel in with the wise men? In chapter 2, he may have been just what we would perceive a little kid. But by chapter 5, he's perhaps what we would consider an old man who's no longer useful. What do you think, the Lord could use him when he was a 12-year-old boy? Absolutely, he proved that. Now, could the Lord use him as a 79-year-old man? Oh, no. He's too old now. That's wrong. The heathen still had sense enough to go get Daniel. Give you a free lesson. You're never too old to be used by the Lord. If we ever concede in our minds that I'm too young or I'm too old, you're wrong. You are absolutely wrong. So Daniel had to be approximately 79 years old from really the minimum. Perhaps he was even older than that. Verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, now watch this, art thou that Daniel? Now what does that imply? It seems that Belshazzar had never actually laid his eyes on Daniel, right? He's looking at him. Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king, my father, mine has a translation mark there that even says forefather, brought out of Jewry or Judah? Verse 14, I, now look at this, have even heard of thee. Do you see that? What can we glean from that? Belshazzar had definitely heard of Daniel, but it doesn't seem that he had ever laid his eyes on him. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods, plural, is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now, verse 15, the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. Now, verse 16, and I, he says it again, I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, why do you think the king would talk like this to what would apparently be an aged man? These are butter-up statements. Don't you see that? The king's used to saying whatever he needs to say to get people to do what he wants them to do. So he thinks if I promise this, what would be old man, if I make these promises to him, he's going to do what I want him to do. Isn't that the way rich people act sometimes? I got something you want, so if you'll do what I want you to do, I'm going to give you some nice stuff. Well, there's a lesson there. But let's move on. Now, the second part of this sermon. In Daniel 5, verses 17 to 31, let's see the meaning. We've seen the miracle. Now let's understand the meaning. In Daniel 5, verses 17 through 24, this is the disapproval. You tell me, if you were 79 years old, would you talk to any king anywhere on this planet like this? Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Now, why do you think Daniel would say that? Well, it's pretty clear Daniel could care less about monetary rewards. I ain't looking for your stuff, buddy. You keep your gifts. This is not why I'm not motivated by money. And he's making this clear that, yes, I am a prophet of God, but you don't buy off the Lord's prophets. So as far as that goes, you can keep your gifts to yourself or give them to somebody else. Yet, the verse continues, I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. You know, most people are swayed to speak what others want to hear. Have you noticed that? Let me tell you what a problem that we have as human beings. A lot of people will say what you want to hear when you're there. And when you're not there and they're around this group, they'll say what this group wants to hear. It is becoming a more and more rare thing to find anybody who will say the same thing everywhere all the time to everybody. When you meet him, point him out to me, because I want to shake his hand. This will sink in at some point in your life. Verse 18. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Could you imagine the depth of that statement right there? You're standing before who is still king, at least co-regent, but still a king with his father. And you're telling him your ancestor didn't just get what he had on his own accord. Where did he get it? What does Daniel say? O thou king, the most high God. What did he do? He gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Verse 19. And for the majesty that he, God, gave him, Nebuchadnezzar, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Who's him there? That's Nebuchadnezzar. Whom he, Nebuchadnezzar, would, he slew. And whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up. And whom he would, he put down. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar did as he pleased. Makes sense. But in Nebuchadnezzar doing as he pleased, who gave him that kingdom and power and glory and majesty? Where did he get it? Did he invent it on his own accord? The answer is no. He got it from the Most High God. Verse 20. But there's definitely a strong contrast right here. But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride. Is Daniel telling the truth? Would you talk like this about a man's granddaddy? Huh? Be honest. Would you talk like this about the President of the United States' granddaddy? But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And, verse 21, he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the, we'll take some liberty here, wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till he knew. What did he need to know? That the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. I would advise you to go back and reread Daniel chapter 4. Go back and reread Daniel chapter 4 again and see what had to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that God ruled the kingdom of men, and it is God who determines who is in power and when they are in power. Nebuchadnezzar got to his lofty position by the power of God. Nebuchadnezzar was removed from his lofty position. How? By the power of the same God. Now, look at verse 22. And thou his son, that would literally be grandson, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though, what does Daniel say? Though thou knewest all this. Whoa. What did Daniel just remove? Not that it could have been played anyway, but you know, people still play this card. I didn't know. The ignorance card. What did Daniel just remove? Friend, you can't plead ignorance. You knew everything that happened to your granddaddy. You knew all this. And what have you been doing? Friend, do you see a lesson right there? Have we not seen the handwriting on the wall of our own people's lives? Think about what your granddaddy did, good or bad. Did you learn those lessons? What about your daddy? Did you not see the handwriting on the wall in your daddy's life? And yet what do? We know all these things and we make the same mistakes anyway. Why is that? Why is that? Well, let's read on and see what we can figure. Verse 23. Count these pronouns, incidentally. Look how Daniel uses all these pronouns, and look how they're used against Belshazzar. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. Now look at this statement. And the God in whose hand thy breath is. Could you imagine telling a heathen that? You know, basically all the people we know generally believe in the God of the Bible, don't they? Imagine dealing with a heathen that doesn't believe that. And telling him, you know, your breath is in God's hand. And he'll do with you exactly as he pleases. It's a little intimidating, isn't it? And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Verse 24. Then was the part of the hand sent from him. Who's him right there? Him is the same God that Belshazzar had not glorified. The same God in whose breath thy hand is. And this writing was written. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, if you'll recall, humbled himself. Belshazzar exalted himself. Think about this. How did he do that? Nebuchadnezzar left those vessels which he had taken out of the house of God in Jerusalem. Apparently, he just left them alone. But what did Belshazzar do? He brought them out and defiled them, drank wine in them, and praised false gods in them. There is a difference. Now, in Daniel 5, verses 25 through 29, let's see the discovery that happens. Look at verse 25. And this is the writing that was written. MENE, MENE TEKEL UPHARSIN. See, I told y'all I wasn't up here talking in tongues. Didn't I say that? That's in the Bible. Isn't that in the Bible? That's in the Bible. This is the interpretation of the thing. MENE, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Babylon was set on high for a limited amount of time. And guess what happened? Time is up. It's done. Verse 27. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Weighed on the righteous scales of Jehovah, this kingdom was, of whom Belshazzar was co-regent, and found utterly lacking integrity and honesty. You don't weigh up on God's scales of righteousness. Verse 28, Perez, thy kingdom, and incidentally that's the same word as Upharsin in verse 25. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, this kingdom had been divided or cut away from Belshazzar. Now, from Belshazzar's perspective, how do you think this prophecy is? You think this is positive? Time is up. You've been weighed on the scales of righteousness and you don't weigh up. And the kingdom has been taken from you and given to the Medes and Persians. How would you feel? You say, oh, wow, drinking wine in the Lord's vessels was sure worth it, wasn't it? Praising these false gods. You see how life is sometimes? See the handwriting on the wall. Now look at verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, just like he said, and put a chain of gold about his neck, just like he said, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom, just like he said. Why would you think this heathen, godless, disrespectful person would keep his promise? I can tell you if I was him why I would. Maybe if I did what I said I was going to do, I'd escape all this that you just said about me. Wouldn't you keep your word? Well, guess what? There's a point of no return. Belshazzar had already crossed the line. Now, it was good for him to keep his word, but it was too little, far too late. Now, in Daniel 5, verses 30 and 31, Belshazzar dies. Look at verse 30. Does it say 30 days? Does it say in 3 months? Does it say 3 years later? See, friend, sometimes by the time you figure out it's happened, it's too late. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans. Remember the Chaldeans, ruling class Babylonians? The king of the Chaldeans slain. Now, doesn't this put that drinking banquet in perspective? Remember what I told you? How did all this happen? It seems that maybe he even knew the Medes and the Persians were all over Babylon and he didn't even care. Let's go have a drinking party. Let's drink it away. Let's act like life's not really going on and it just won't go on. What happened to him? That same night he died. Now look at verse 31. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, just as Daniel, as a younger man, had prophesied, and as we already had read ahead, had said again as an old man. The word of the Lord is immutable. It will happen. Babylon fell just like God said it would, and the Medes and the Persians are the ones that made them fall. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Let me give you some information that you'll never, probably ever remember. Historically, this man is known as Ugbaru. I'm sure that was probably potentially going to be your son's middle name, but you wisely chose against it. He ruled for all of about a month before being killed in battle, and he was succeeded, watch this, by a man named Darius. Although historically speaking, the Darius who succeeded Darius was known as Gubaru. Again, you know those names. So there's Daniel chapter 5. Quickly, let's get the motivation. Let's get some motivation for today's life. I want to give you 4 words. Number 1, freedom. You do realize that you, as a free moral agent, you can act however you want to act. You know why you're here sitting in the pew right now? Because you chose to be here. Because you determined. You looked at life and said, you know what? I'd rather be around the Lord's people hearing the Bible preached than I would be at home doing whatever you could be doing. And I'm sure you have plenty to do. But consider the aspect of free moral agency. Though we can do whatever we want to do, there's a day of reckoning that every single one of us is going to face. You can live however you please, but when you die, then what? What's going to happen then? Have you paid attention to the last few verses of the book of Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Isn't that a sobering thought? You can act however you want to act, but just realize all of us are going to give account to God. Word number 2, foolishness. Drunkenness and idolatry cause personal problems. True? Let me tell you the biggest personal problem that comes from drunkenness and idolatry. You separate yourself from God. Read Galatians 5:19-21 again. You live like that and die like that, you won't go to heaven. But I'm going to give you something else to consider from the book of Galatians. It's Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. You already heard it in part. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. What would you rather choose to reap in eternity? Bad things? Good things. Guess what? We're all planting in this life. And when we breathe our last breath and step into eternity, we're going to reap exactly what we have sowed. Word number 3, faith. Daniel was faithful. Even on Nebuchadnezzar, when you go back and read chapter 4, he was convinced of God's mighty power. Are we? You know, why you may be thinking, why even preach through the book of Daniel? It's very simple. Romans 15:4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Have we learned anything from the book of Daniel? I'm telling you we have. And then word number 4 is forgiveness. Belshazzar was given one lifetime to make it right. Do you know how much time you have? You have one lifetime. You have one lifetime to make it right. Unfortunately, he failed. Where are you right now? Have you received the Lord's forgiveness? Let me give you one simple verse that you need to consider. Acts 2:38. Then Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. And you shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. Do you believe that verse? Have you obeyed just that verse? Something to think about, isn't it? Can you see the handwriting on the wall in your own life? Can you see it? You know, when you start examining it and you reflect back on your life and you reflect on the lives of your loved ones, we've made some terrible mistakes, haven't we? One day it may be too late, and one day it will be too late. You better be ready. God is for you, and Satan is against you. You cast the deciding vote. What are you going to do? We each determine our own eternities. I'm going to try to influence you at least one more time. Choose God's way. His way is the best way. His way is the only way that you'll live eternally. Hear the truth. Romans 10:17. Believe the truth, Acts 16:31. Repent of sin, Acts 17:30. Confess Jesus Christ as the Son of God, Acts 8:37. Be immersed in water for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38. Brethren, we got to be faithful. We got to be faithful unto death, Revelation 2:10. Wherever you are, come now as together we stand as we sing the song of encouragement.